Hi everyone, Alastair here from Viking. It's good to be back with you. I hope you're all well. Now I have someone I'd like to introduce you to today. You may or may not have already come across him. Until a year ago, I was slightly ashamed to admit his name meant nothing to me at all. That was until I was lucky enough to go to the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, where I saw his work for the first time. And the man I'm talking about was a photographer and a cinematographer, a writer, and also a raconteur. And most importantly, for our purposes today, he was the pioneer of modern polar photography. His name is George Herbert Ponting, and I decided I'd call this talk The Great White Silence, because not only is it a beautiful way to describe a place like the Antarctic, but also because it is the title of a film that Ponting made while he was there, which served as the official record of Captain Scott's legendary expedition to the South Pole from 1910 to 1913. So Herbert Ponting was born in the town of Salisbury in the south of England. His father was a very successful and wealthy banker, and he wanted his son, Herbert, to have a similar career in banking. And indeed, after leaving school, Ponting Jr. did spend 4 years working in a bank, but such a life was never really going to be exciting enough to satisfy this young man's desires for adventure. So having heard some tales of the opportunities available in the American West at that time, Ponting moved to California. With some money from his father, he bought a fruit farm, and he also fell in love and he got married. Now, unfortunately, or perhaps for us, fortunately, the fruit farm business failed, and after a brief spell back in England, Ponting returned to the United States, and at that point he decided that he would turn his hobby of photography into a career. So a chance meeting with a professional photographer in California at that time encouraged him, the meeting there was with another photographer who encouraged him to enter his pictures into competitions. And some of these he won, and this led to him getting work published in magazines. In 1901, Ponting then, with his itchy feet, decided to go further afield. He took himself off to the Far East, where as a freelancer, he traveled about extensively, visiting such places as China and Burma and Japan and India, photographing people, landscapes and wildlife. And it seems that not only did Ponting have a talent for photography, he was also a pretty good travel writer. And his illustrated articles began to appear regularly in publications in the then growing magazine market in Europe. But by 1906, having made his bones, as it were, in Asia, he was back in Europe, still roaming around from country to country and contributing illustrated articles to the periodicals of the day. Now, in 1910, he published a really lovely book of photographs that I enjoyed reading. It's some pretty good travel writing, called In Lotus Land, Japan. And he was elected the same year as a fellow of the prestigious Royal Geographic Society. And it was around this time that Ponting's growing reputation as an experienced and talented photographer reached the ears of the British explorer, whose name you will know, Robert Falcon Scott, who at the time was planning his second exploration of the Antarctic region, usually referred to as the Terra Nova Expedition, after the name of the ship that would take them there. And now for Scott, this expedition had two primary purposes: to undertake scientific research of the region and to claim the honor of being the first humans to reach the South Pole. Now, in order to fund this expedition, Scott had incurred a lot of debt, which he planned to repay on his return from the South Pole, with lectures and publications. So he realized that photography would play an important part in the scientific and geographical recording of the trip they were undertaking. And he was also well aware of the propaganda value of having some superb images. So Herbert Ponting was recruited as expedition photographer, and interestingly was paid a higher salary than any of the scientists on the trip. Also, most importantly, this was the first time that a professional photographer was included on an Antarctic expedition. So the Terra Nova, which was a tough old whaling ship, left Cardiff on the 15th of June 1910 with Ponting on board. Its destination was Ross Island in Antarctica, where they arrived in January 1911. And from the very beginning of the voyage, Ponting was busy with his camera, documenting life on board the Terra Nova, and sometimes even getting the crew to construct wooden planks jutting out from the side of the ship, which he could get out and sit on and get a better angle for his photos. And heavy seas didn't deter him either, as you can see in this rather dramatic image of the ship in a storm with sailors pumping water out from the bilges. Now, this photo is one of the photographs from the sea journey to Antarctica that I keep coming back to. It shows Captain Oates posing with the horses that he was responsible for looking after, and which were to be used to haul the team's equipment and supplies across the ice and snow. And the reason this image resonates so much for me is that, for all its apparent calmness, approximately 2 years after it was taken, the man in the picture, Captain Oates, in a heroic act of great self-sacrifice, would stagger out of a tent and into a freezing blizzard and to his death. But first, I should give you a little background. This period was, at the beginning of the 19th century, known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. And the explorers who took part in it were very much the celebrities, the rock stars of their day. Men like Scott and Shackleton and Amundsen and Nansen. These guys all knew each other. They wrote letters to each other, and the rivalry and disputes between them could sometimes be intense. The main objective of the Terra Nova expedition, Scott, according to Scott, who's at the top right of the on your screen, was to reach the South Pole and to secure for the British Empire the honor of this achievement. It was only later, whilst in Australia, on his way to the Antarctic, that Scott received news that, well, in fact, he got a letter from Amundsen telling him that he would also be attempting the same feat, and that it had now become a race, the race to the South Pole. And this captured the public imagination, and as a consequence, the interest from the media became intense. So when the Terra Nova finally arrived at Ross Island in the Antarctic in January 1911, Ponting busied himself with the others, helping to build their winter camp at a place called Cape Evans. This picture gives a good idea of the kind of living conditions they were in. And here is a picture of Captain Scott in his room in the hut. This is, funny enough, a picture I remember from my childhood. I was always struck by how actually rather cozy it looks. I think Scott's probably writing up his daily journal, and this kind of seeming coziness contrasts with the tragic drama that was awaiting him down at the pole. And included in the camp was a tiny dark room that where Ponting could develop his glass plates, and which also doubled up as his sleeping quarters. So on one of his first walkabouts away from the ship, Ponting went across to investigate this strange black teardrop shape in the ice, which led him to take his most famous image, and the one for which he has since become to be most associated with. The title is Grotto in an Iceberg, and in this naturally formed cavern, Ponting posed a couple of scientists down at the entrance there to give a sense of scale, and included the ship, the Terra Nova, a mile away in the background. So not only is it a great documentary photo of the region, but it's also aesthetically, I think, a pretty stunning picture. And about this photo, Ponting, he wrote in his diary, "A fringe of long icicles hung at the entrance of the grotto, and passing under these, I was in the most wonderful place imaginable. From outside, the interior appeared quite white and colorless, but once inside, it was a lovely symphony of blue and green." And he also said of this image, "I secured none more beautiful the entire time I was in the South." Incidentally, though many photographers were shooting on film by this time, 1910, Ponting elected to use a glass plate camera, which, although it was cumbersome and difficult to move around and heavy to operate, he liked it because it produced images of a much superior quality. And this trick of placing people in pictures, in his photos, to give a sense of scale, was something Ponting did a lot. Despite the severe conditions and extraordinarily low temperatures, Ponting was extremely meticulous in his work as a photographer, and would take a long time setting up his photos. So much so, in fact, that amongst his fellow explorers, his name became a verb. His companions would joke that to pont, or to go ponting, meant walking far away in the freezing cold and then standing very still in one place, usually for a long time. Now, Ponting would also take great risks in trying to get as close as possible to his subjects. The expedition scientists were obviously keen to study the behavior of the Antarctic wildlife, the whales and the penguins and the seals. And in fact, Ponting, he nearly died once when a pod of killer whales he was trying to photograph decided to break up the ice on which he was standing. He spent a total of about 14 months down at the Cape Evans camp, documenting the daily life of his companions. I love this photo. You can see, I love the idea. They actually took a piano all the way down there. And if you look very carefully at the photo, you can see standing on top of the piano, there's some books. And the book that's nearest the camera is Ponting's own book on Japan that I mentioned earlier. You could say an early example of product placement. Of course, he also photographed the scientists at their work and carrying out their experiments. And most importantly, he made his beautiful, timeless photographs of the great white silence of the Antarctic landscapes. When the time came, it was decided that Ponting, as a middle-aged man, was too old to be part of the team that would be charged with hauling the heavy supplies on sledges further south in the push towards the pole. So at the beginning of 1912, Ponting, together with 1,700 photographic glass plates that he'd made and with his cine film that he'd also shot, boarded the ship and the Terra Nova and sailed back to civilization, having no inkling of the disastrous turn of events that would befall Captain Scott and the remainder of the expedition team. As we know, Captain Scott and his 4 companions did indeed reach the South Pole that same year, on the 17th of January 1912. only to discover that there was already a tent there with the Norwegian flag flying above it. Their rival in the race, Roald Amundsen, had beaten them to the pole by just 5 weeks. In his diary for that day, Scott wrote, "The worst has happened. All the daydreams must go. Great God, this is an awful place." And in this photo you're looking at now, taken by Scott, you can see the British explorers standing around the tent with the flag of Norway flying above it, almost mocking them. And you can almost sense from the body language the crushing disappointment those men must have felt after all their efforts. So on the long trek back to their base camp, the 5 explorers were hit by unseasonably low temperatures and raging snowstorms. One of their party died in a fall in a crevasse. Another, Captain Oates, remember him from the photo on the ship with the horses. Well, he sacrificed himself by walking away in a blizzard to give the others a greater chance of survival. And suffering from frostbite and hunger and exhaustion, the 3 remaining men finally died in their tent on the 29th of March, 1912. And tragically, they were just 11 miles from the safety of a supply hut. Later, by now, back in England, Ponting received the news of the tragic ending of the Terra Nova Polar Expedition. So his collection of photos and cinefilm now became a memorial to the memory of Scott and his companions, rather than a celebration of the achievement as had been initially planned. In one of his last entries before he died, Scott requested that the families of his men should be financially provided for. Ponting's images, which were used extensively in the press, together with exhibitions and lectures that he gave around the country, resulted in massive donations from the public, enough to pay off all the debts of the expedition and to provide annuities for the widows and the survivors, with the surplus left over, which was used ultimately in the creation of the Scott Polar Institute in Cambridge. And if you watched Professor Julian Dowdeswell's talk on this channel a couple of days ago, and if you didn't, I really recommend it, you'll have seen what a fascinating place it is to visit. I spent a really great day there. And if you should ever find yourself in Cambridge, I would highly recommend going along and seeing it. In 2004, the Institute purchased what is called the Ponting the Ponting collection of photographs, and has had a selection of these made into some stunning platinum prints, again, which I was lucky enough to be allowed to see on my visit there. So just before I conclude on the subject of Ponting, let me just give you a quote from a contemporary explorer whose name is David Hempleton Adams, who said this: "Ponting's images of a hostile corner of an almost unknown part of the world would have been as stunning to early 20th century eyes as the first photos of the surface of the moon were to us." Indeed, I remember those first photos on the moon, and they were pretty stunning. And I can imagine that the photos that Ponting took when the British public got to see them had a similar effect. Now, I haven't actually been to Antarctica yet. I do hope to maybe do so next year when the first Viking expedition ship is completed. But last year, I did travel to the opposite end of the Earth, excuse me, from Captain Scott, when I visited the archipelago of Svalbard, high up in the Arctic Circle. Svalbard is from the Old Norse language, meaning cold edge. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, it served as a base for the whaling ships that roamed the Barents Sea, harpooning whales for their blubber. And Russian hunters also went there, attracted by the polar bears and the Arctic foxes. And much later, at the beginning of the 20th century, coal mining started and permanent settlements were established. And today, with its tiny population of just 2,500 people, a small amount of mining still remains, but now it's tourism and research that are the two principal commercial activities on Svalbard. The landscape is fascinating. It's a mix of glaciers and mountains, of ice fields and tundra. And if photography is your thing, then it's a paradise. Amazing landscapes are everywhere. And this, like this beautiful ice estuary that I got very excited about. And these mountains are dramatically sculpted by millions of years of erosion. In the summer months, at this latitude, the sun never sinks below the horizon. And the light in the early hours of the morning is quite different from the light in the daytime. It has a strange ethereal glow to it. Sometimes it really felt that I'd been transported to another planet. Now, there are no roads on Svalbard outside of settlements, so traveling around is done by boat, or in the winter, when there's enough snow, by snowmobile. One day, on my visit there, we took a boat out to go and have a look at some glaciers close up. And being near to these giant walls of ice, literally thousands of years old, creaking and grumbling as they inch their way down into the sea, was a truly moving experience. And there was one moment that day when our guide leant over the side of the boat and with her knife cut off a chunk of glacier ice, which she then used to make the most extraordinary gin and tonic I've ever had in my life. As the ice melts in your glass, bubbles of air that have been trapped there for centuries are released, and your drink literally snaps, crackles, and pops in your hand. Another reason to go to Svalbard, apart from the amazing landscapes, is for the different kinds of wildlife. I came across this little Arctic fox running up and down the hillsides, wearing his little thin summer coat. Also the small Svalbard reindeer, which were very nearly hunted to extinction, but are now thankfully a protected species. And of course, polar bears. I say of course because although there are more polar bears than people in Svalbard, whilst I was there, we only came across one, this large male. And we followed him for quite some time from the safety of our boat, watching, fascinated, as he swaggered his way along the shoreline, mighty and fearless, a real master in his own universe. Whilst out on the water, we encountered the world's largest mammal, the magnificent blue whale. And these huge snoozing walruses lounging around like a bunch of Roman senators after a bacchanalian feast. And the next day, amazingly, white beluga whales we saw, sometimes called the canaries of the sea because of the way they squeak and squeal so loudly. And one of the strangest places I visited whilst I was in this strange land was the Russian coal mining town of Barentsburg. Now there are about 450 people living there all the year round, Russians and Ukrainians, most of them who work in the mines. And visiting Barentsburg really does feel like stepping back in time to the Soviet era. It's a little rough around the edges, but I found it to be oddly charming with its retro architecture, its statues of Lenin, and pretty little Russian Orthodox church. Being in Svalbard was really unlike anywhere else I've ever been in my life. On this cold edge, up at the top of the earth, it feels remote. It is remote. The sky seems wider, the air purer, the water cleaner. And the noisy, chaotic, overcrowded places many of us have to live in today, it's kind of reassuring to know that out there somewhere, we still have, to quote Ponting, the great white silence. So Svalbard was memorable, and I'd be very happy to go back there anytime. And I don't know whether any of you have ever been there. I'd love to hear if you have, and if you enjoyed it quite as much as I did. So we get on to some questions. Let's have a little look, see what we've got coming in. Well, first question has nothing to do with photography. It's from Greg and Wendy, and they say, hi, Alastair, I hope you're going to give us an update on your garden today. Well, for those of you who weren't watching before, I created when this lockdown started, I decided it was time to create a vegetable garden. And Wendy and Greg, I'm happy to tell you, I ate my first courgettes from the garden last week, and pretty soon I'll be starting on the tomatoes. So it's going well out there. A question from Michael Jurek in Oak Park, Michigan. Michael says, do you have a favorite focal length lens you like to use? And when traveling, what kind of strobes or artificial light do you use? Michael, yeah, my favorite lens is, if I can only take one lens with me, it would be my, I think my 70 to 200 f2.8 Nikon lens. It's not only does it give pictures, is it a great piece of glass, it has great quality. I just love the way that that range from 70 to 200, especially at the 200 end, compresses things slightly, which really makes them jump out from whether you're looking at them on a page or on a website or whatever. So I guess that would be my go-to lens. Probably, well, something I have done in the past, it's quite an interesting exercise though, is to just take a 50mm lens and only force yourself only to use that for a day, because 50mm is pretty much the kind of the focal length of the human eye, and it's the lens, for example, that people like Cartier-Bresson would only use because they were purists. So by going out just with a camera and a 50mm lens on it, you're kind of forced to you kind of re-enter a sort of purity of photography. So you're not relying on extreme effects of wide angle or long telephoto lenses. And I think it's an interesting thing to do. Sorry, very long question here. So this is a long question from Lenny in Oslo. Hi, Lenny. She's been to the Antarctic and the Arctic, and loves taking pictures there. She's asking, which of the photos do you love the most of the ones you've showed us, and why? Well, you know, Lenny, it's choosing a favorite photo is a bit like asking which is your favorite child. I think certainly my Svalbard and my time in Svalbard, and also the times that I've spent not on Svalbard but up at the top of Norway, it's just the whole experience is wonderful. Partly because it's a landscape that I'm not that familiar with, so everything seems exciting. And I guess, you know, the polar bear from Svalbard, well, that was pretty. Just seeing that animal in real life, was in the wild, was really quite special. And I think the photos never really do justice to how impressive an animal like that is. But I wasn't disappointed with what we got, although we had to, we were quite a long way away. I was using a long lens. I think it was a 200 to 500 mil zoom lens, Nikon zoom lens. So that has a great range scope to it, pulled me in. But I guess that was probably my favorite photo. Other than that, just the landscapes which are literally, well, not literally, but really feel as if you've been transported to another planet. Oh, lots of questions. Okay, here's one from Parker Emerson in Claremont. How were they able to process the wet plate glass images in the cold? Yeah, good question, Parker. Well, I can answer that because I've done some wet plate photography myself. And you're right, if you're shooting wet plates images, and I won't go into the whole explanation of what wet plates are, except that they don't work in extreme cold. So it wouldn't work in the kind of temperatures they had up there. But Ponting wasn't using wet plates. He was, by that time, dry plate photography had been invented. And so it made things a lot easier for him in that sense. Although, as I say, he chose to complicate his life by using a glass plate camera, because being Ponting, he wanted it was all about the quality. And although the glass plate camera was a lot more cumbersome than the film cameras that were available at that time, he wanted to get the best quality he could. And if you ever get to see the originals of the pictures that he took, they really do have a wonderful incredible quality to them. Tony Hackenberg in the Villages, Florida. Hi, Tony. Is Ponting's movie you mentioned at the start available to view? Tony, I'm not sure. Yes, it must be available to view. I'll just tell you one interesting thing about that film, The Great White Silence, and certainly, yes, I think I'm pretty sure you can go online and watch certainly parts of it, if not all of it. I need to ask Professor Dowdenswell at the Scott Polar Institute whether they have it. I don't know. But one interesting thing about that movie was that when the First World War came along in 1914, the whole Scott Polar story got sort of a little bit forgotten because the world was at war. And Ponting, who wanted to go and wanted to join the army and go and fight, was again found to be a little too old for that. But what he did do was take his film and The Great White Silence and show it to the troops, and it was used as a kind of as a moral boosting exercise. This was the time of the end of the time of the British Empire, and a film like that was thought to be to raise the morale of the British fighting troops out on the Western Front. Patricia. Hi, Patricia in Belchertown. Patricia, you mentioned, she says, you mentioned that there are more polar bears than people in Svalbard. Does this pose a danger to residents? Yeah, it does, actually. Although, I mean, very few people actually get killed by polar bear attacks. And one of the reasons that they don't is because in Svalbard, whenever you're going pretty much anywhere outside, especially if you're going outside of a settlement, you always have you'll have a rifle with you, and you'll probably have a pistol which will fire off capsules that will make explosions, bang, loud noises, and that'll scare polar bears away. But they are because of the melting of the ice. Polar bears are, although they're not diminishing in numbers, in fact, the opposite, they're increasing in numbers. But they are coming more and more into settlements and looking for food. So, so yeah, there is a bit of an increased threat. I think also what's interesting is that should you find yourself in a situation where you have to shoot a polar bear because you're being attacked by one, it's a pretty serious business. I mean, not only because you've killed a polar bear, but because the authorities will treat it as if you have shot a human being, and there will be a police investigation, a thorough police investigation, because this is a protected species, and the Norwegians, especially up in that part of the world, take these things very seriously, as they should. Bear with me. 1 second. You mentioned Ponting. Charles in San Jose, does the Ponting collection have a public gallery of the images in the collection? Yeah, go to the collection is owned by the Scott Polar Institute, and that's the place to go in Cambridge, and you can have a look at them. Why do glass plates, this is from Gene Holt in Missouri, why do glass plates have better resolution? Because, Gene, because they're bigger, because they're quarter plates, so they're this kind of size, and you're getting more bang for your buck. You've got a bigger image to work with, rather than using a slightly smaller film image. 1 second. Sorry, bear with me. A lot of questions here. I got one that came in earlier here from Rick in San Diego. Hi, Rick. Rick says, any advice for taking pictures in cold climates? And yes, Rick, I found that the biggest problem I have whenever I've been taking pictures somewhere where it's really cold, the biggest problem I've had is one of condensation. In fact, two problems: condensation and batteries. Condensation because you're often going from somewhere warm to somewhere cold. You may, for example, you leave your hotel, you get into a warm car, you drive somewhere, you get out of the car, you want to start taking pictures, and you can't because your camera's completely fogged up, and it takes a while for that to clear. And I don't think it does the camera any good getting moisture inside it. So there are ways around this. You can what you need to do is really give your cameras time to adapt to the change in temperature. So, for example, when we got back to our quarters in the evening, I would put the camera outside. I would put the camera into a Ziploc bag, and then take that inside, and the moisture would form on the outside of the bag, but not on the inside, and the camera would slowly have time to warm up without getting condensation inside it. Also, batteries somehow seem to run down quicker in cold climates. So one thing that's important, I think, to do, what I always do, is make sure that the batteries are in pockets where they're nice and warm, and also, and this is as a general rule, just to have plenty of fully charged spare batteries with you, because there is nothing more frustrating than being in front of a great image that you want to photograph, and your camera runs out of batteries and you haven't got any spare ones. So yeah, condensations and batteries. Also, cold climates, well, you invest, this is really worth spending money on, in a great pair of gloves. I actually use 2 pairs. I have one very thin pair that I can wear and still operate the controls on my camera. And on top of those, I put a much thicker pair. And I see now, I don't actually own any of these, but now you have these rather clever gloves that have fingertips that pull back, and with little magnets that hold them in place, and you kind of flip the fingertip back, which enables you to either make adjustments on your camera or use your finger on a if you want to use a screen, or a touch screen or whatever. What else have we got? Somebody Sheldon Kirsch asked, how well do modern cameras function in extreme temperatures? Pretty well. On the whole, I've never really had a serious problem. I have heard of, I was told the other day about a photographer who was going somewhere so cold that he somehow, and I don't know how he did this, he took his camera apart and took out all the grease inside it that makes the movements function smoothly. And because where he was going, he was worried that it would be so cold that the grease was going to literally solidify and his camera would freeze up. That seems pretty extreme to me. I've never had, I've never had a camera not function because it's been that cold. As I say, the main problem has just been, for me, has been one of condensation. Good. Well, there's plenty more questions. I'll go through them and I'll try to answer them. I'll try to answer them individually to you by email. Question here about polarizing filters. Do you use a polarizing filter? Yes, I do. Polarizing filters, I think, you know, if you're going to have one filter in your bag, no, have two filters. Make sure you have two filters when you go out photographing, especially when you're going somewhere where there's water. I'd say have a UV filter, an ultraviolet filter, just because it'll protect your lens. And I keep a UV filter on my lens, on all my lenses all the time. Other than that, have a polarizing filter, because the great thing the polarizing filters do, if you're anywhere near water, and I did this a lot up in Svalbard, if you're anywhere near water, the polarizing filter will take off the shine on the reflection on the surface of the water. And the water will, and just shiny surfaces in general, will just look a whole lot better. Plus, with the sky, you get a much richer, deeper blue in the sky, and clouds can really pop. You get a better saturation when you use a polarizing filter. I think that they don't work quite so well on wide-angle lenses. You need to be careful because you're getting that much more sky in that you can end up with one part of the sky is almost black, it's so dark, and another part which is kind of light blue, and that just looks it just looks strange. So but yes, polarizing filters are super important, and I wouldn't be without one. That's really something worth investing in if you don't have one already. Anyway, it's been lovely sharing with you this evening some of the work of my new buddy, Herbert Ponting, and I hope you've enjoyed looking at these photos, and maybe they'll encourage you to one day come and visit either the Arctic or the Antarctic. And if you do, I hope I'm on board, and it'd be lovely to see you. So thank you for watching, and I wish you, as always, good light.